Hey, howdy folks. How y'all doing? Feeling good? Well, I am happy to be back with you. I'm Novak Stephenson, and in our last chapter, we discussed Adam and Eve and the creation of man. In this chapter, we'll take the next steps and follow the evolution of man into civilizations and societies that bore individual religions. Remember, we talked in the last chapter about Adam and Eve being synonymous with primeval couples in many different creation stories, as well as the first soulful humans, not the first humans. So picking up from there and following the religious timeline, we open with Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve's children, which puts us right about here on our timeline, after the creation of the world, and somewhere around 9,000 to about 4,000 BC. So in the Genesis account, Adam and Eve's first two children were brothers. Cain was a farmer, Abel kept the flocks. Both brought offerings to the Creator as gifts, but only Abel's was acceptable. So Cain became enraged with jealousy and killed his brother. Partially to punish, partially to protect, the Creator then exiled Cain and he traveled east. If the Genesis account is correct, then that would perfectly work with our knowledge of the Mesopotamian river valley being the first civilization where the Garden of Eden was located between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, followed by the Indus River Valley civilization due east of the Fertile Crescent. So you can see how it makes a crescent shape, thus its name. And when y'all should go and read what happens next in the story found in Genesis 4, because it's surprisingly interesting and it draws a lot of questions. It says Cain married, but where did his wife come from? What was this city he was building? Where did all of these other people come from? The mention of stringed instruments, pipes, bronze, iron, which I found very helpful in dating Adam and Eve as discussed in the last chapter. But those minor details are concurrent with the archaeological records of the time and the origins of those first patriarchal family units building properly dated cities, the tools, even religion. This is an incredibly interesting time in the human experience on Earth, the origins of civilizations and societies. Here we move the conversation through science and history into anthropology and archaeology. Now we have modern man established and they start making babies. This was the first time in history where the family patriarch was the spiritual, political, warrior chief for the family, which, if done right, could then grow them into a tribe, a village, city, country. If all went well for the expansion of his people, then they'd grow into a great nation thanks to Grandpa. All of which is a very another important milestone in the evolution of man. We know the very first behaviorally modern humans were hunters and gatherers. They were small, nomadic, and egalitarian. Then that evolved into a pastoral horticultural society based on pasturing animals or planting. We can see they used hand tools, had a dependable food source, which led them to staying in one place, which led to an increase in population, more permanent housing structures, division of labor, trade, which led to inequalities and is considered the first social revolution. The second social revolution was into an agricultural society. Here we found evidence of evolved hand tools. Food surplus led to further increases of population. Cities developed. That led to different jobs and activities. There's more to that, but we'll skip it. What's important here is we see the birth of civilizations. Humans had officially moved up in the world. So what's a civilization? Mostly it's the political leadership with rules, norms, laws, written or unwritten. It's language and possibly writing. It's agricultural and urbanization. It's military and economics for trade, travel, transport, labor. It's also religious. The earliest changes visible in the archaeological record relate not to food production, but to social relations, indicated not only in the tendency to reside in one location over a longer period of time, and in the investment of labor in more substantial and permanent housing structures, but also in the growth of ritual. Let's go back to that word norms, because it's important. Norms are rules. spoken and unspoken, that a group uses to guide how people should act and in a given group or society that dictate appropriate and inappropriate values, beliefs, behaviors, attitudes. There's an unperceivable unification which happens naturally in any group that systematizes everyone's behaviors. And as finer communication develops, the conformity of the clan is further established, even in non-secular groups. Identifying norms is merely creating awareness and labeling a natural, unintentional law of social relations. And human beings are especially social. One of the main questions I wanted to know was regarding how humans became religious. Well, norms. Norms are how we got religions. Norms are the root of religion, and it's different from a relationship. People are constantly watching others. They're learning, analyzing, developing, usually for their personal or for the group's benefit. So when someone starts a movement in a step to possibly draw closer to the Creator, it naturally gains traction and pulls in followers. Here's what worked for me. God might like if you did X, Y, Z. You can create an army if you unify the people with a mission. For just a few examples of religious beliefs that could gain a following. Next thing you know, people have created a cultural system of behaviors and practices that relate humanity to each other and to the supernatural. Possibly someone decides to write that information down and you get religious texts, then passed to future generations. The first civilizations were the Mesopotamian River Valley, where the Garden of Eden was said to be located. Second, the Indus River Valley civilization, located east of Eden and possibly pioneered by Cain. And then the third is the Egyptian civilization, which we'll talk about in a minute. If you're anything like I was, then you probably need to dramatically expand your idea of what these civilizations were like. These were not a jumbled collection of seedy mud huts in a field. These were bustling cities with 3-story brick buildings that had indoor plumbing and beautifully decorated houses, granaries, citadels, burial grounds, and bathing platforms, all cleverly designed on a grid system by a city planner to be considerate of health and hygiene. Y'all, the Harappan houses had flush toilets inside, which I found to be completely mind-blowing. So when Genesis 4:7 says that Cain was building a city, it really meant a city. Cain's boys had skills, seemingly better than his brother's kids over in Mesopotamia. Adam and Eve did have more offspring, namely Seth and a few other nameless children. And while they're maintaining a personal relationship with their Creator, I noticed a new religion that popped up in Cain's region. Nowadays we call it Hinduism, but it was very different then, also known as ancient Vedic religion. I disagree for the reasons that I'm detailing here, but historians will call this the very first religion. I'm proposing that Cain's retelling of his youthful experiences with the Creator snowballed into Vedic polytheism based on what he would have seen and learned before he left Eden. I say that because the roots match especially well when it comes to their main god, Brahman and Karma. So follow me here. Hindu scriptures describe ultimate reality as Brahman. Brahman is non-dual, pure consciousness, indivisible, incorporeal, infinite, all-pervading, the basis of all awareness and the source of all bliss, the soul of all souls, one without a second, the constant witness of the changing phenomena of the universe. From the absolute point of view, Brahman alone exists. The transcendent Brahman manifests itself as a personal God, the creator, preserver, and destroyer of the universe. Their holy book, the Upanishads, describe God as the supreme person. His eyes, hands, faces are everywhere, his ears everywhere. He exists compassing all. The heavens are his head, the sun and the moon his eyes, the quarters his ears, the revealed Vedas his speech. The wind is his breath, the universe is his heart. The various godheads of Hinduism, such as Shiva, Vishnu, Brahma, Kali, Durga, are but different facets of Brahman. That sounds exactly like the creator Adam and Eve were worshiping. In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna says, whenever there is a decline of dharma, righteousness, O Bharata, and a rise of adharma, unrighteousness, I incarnate myself for the protection of the good, for the destruction of the wicked, and for the establishment of dharma. I am born in every age. The law that nicely holds it all together is called karma, which can be found in the Upanishads. The doer of good becomes good, the doer of evil becomes evil. One becomes virtuous by virtuous action, bad by bad action. And I wanted to dive into all of that because it's the first big breakup in religion, and it set a lot of precedents that unfortunately would occur, mostly unintentionally, across all religions. Beyond being religious and having an interest in the heavens grew assorted organized religions. How did those divisions get started? And why would they happen if we're all trying to do the right thing? Let's talk for a moment about a game we're all familiar with and we've played before, the telephone game. The first person starts with a saying, and as it gets passed along, it changes and evolves, almost snowballing into something totally and hilariously different than the original statement. I see that happening with religious truths revolving into religious half-truths and then quarter truths. And I hope it doesn't seem like I'm picking on Hinduism because that's not my intent. No sect is exempt. And for the vast majority of the time, I don't think that anyone is necessarily trying to misappropriate the Creator's word deliberately. These things happen naturally and subtly. I could see Cain telling his kids about the time he'd encounter the Creator embodied, walking in the garden as Genesis says that he would do. When he was evil and killed his brother, for which the Creator stepped in for the protection of good and sent him away. But the individuals form relationships. Relationships form groups. Groups create norms. Norms become guidelines. Guidelines become rules. Rules help build organizations. Organizations centered on norms create religions. That's how having an individual relationship with your God becomes religion, whether helpful or hurtful. So when you look at modern religions and wonder how we could possibly go from one true creator God to a bajillion diverse religions, it's these little shakeups that create a tree of religions. Speaking of individuals, the Genesis story picks back up in Mesopotamia with a relatively random dude, Noah, who was no one special per se. He was a farmer, but he was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Now, the earth was corrupt in God's sight. The Creator said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark out of cypress wood. I am going to bring flood waters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature, everything on earth will perish, but I will establish my covenant with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. Did you know that based on the given dimensions, scholars estimate that almost 45,000 animals could fit into the ark? That's crazy. But bringing all animals doesn't mean 2 of every species. The word species is modern and difficult to understand and define. Most translations use the term kind. In similar uses of the word, it implies vague relatability. Today, we liken it to the taxonomic rank of family, possibly order. Rarely is the word kind equivalent to the genus of species level. There is a whole field of research here called baronymonology. Anyways, Noah was the Creator's redo. Have you ever made something and it goes so awry that the only thing you can do is start over? It's like that. Now, as a rational adult, I had always sort of assumed that Noah's flood was local, covering the known land only. But one note made me pause and reconsider entirely. The Bible mentions the water covered the highest hilltops. But we know water is self-leveling, seeking uniform height, which would be impossible if the flood wasn't global. So upon further research, I learned that the whole Earth does have fossil record of waterlogged remains occurring after the dinosaurs were here. Geologists have found billions of dead animals and plants buried in rock layers composed of water-deposited sand, lime, and mud all around the Earth. So instead of taking millions of years for it to form, most of the fossil-bearing sedimentary rock layers, as seen in the Great Walls of the Grand Canyon and elsewhere, could have been formed rapidly during this global catastrophic flood of Noah. In the 70s, during an unrelated drilling project going down to Earth's core, towards it at least, Russia found enough water to cover the globe. Google the Kola borehole. Man, the 70s are crazy like that. But there are at least 9 different versions of the Mesopotamian flood story, each one more or less adopted from an earlier version. The oldest evidence found was inscribed in 1600 BC in the Sumerian city of Nippur. It's known as the Sumerian flood story, but even still, it was probably derived from yet another earlier version. The hero is King Zizurda. Zizurda tells how he built a boat and rescues life when the gods tried to destroy it, which is basically the same thing as Noah and the other stories. Namely, King Artaxerxes of the Akkadian origin, or Utnapishtim of the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Dravida King Manu in the Matsya Purana, who was told to build a boat by Vishnu to carry the primeval family. There's also Berosus, the Greeks' version, naming the hero Zipsurus. The ancient Greeks' myths say that when mankind became mean and greedy and disobedient to the gods, Zeus decided to destroy them. Only demigod Deucalion and his wife Pariah were saved as the most righteous among men by building an ark per his godfather's advice. The way I see it, so many retellings of this story prove it's true one way or another. This event likely occurred. And the fact that so many religious texts share similar accounts further prove their related origins. After the Great Flood, biblically, Noah's 3 sons repopulated the earth. There was Japheth, Shem, and Ham. Genesis 10 details their corresponding table of nations. Japheth, which is noted in the pink color here in the city's map, they helped to spread the coastal populations, beginning the nations of Greece, Thrace, and Scythia. From Shem, which is in the green here, those became the Semites, and you get the Hebrews, the Chaldeans, Assyrians, Persians, and Syrians. Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Jacob, Joseph, David, and Jesus all came from that lineage, and we'll read about them in upcoming chapters. Then there's Ham, and he is in the yellow color over in here, and they started the ancient Egyptian areas. And so from him comes Cush, Put, Canaan, and Egypt. Yes, Noah had a grandson named Egypt. It's painfully easy when you put it together this way and align it like this. Ham's descendants became the Hittites, Amorites, the Philistines, and Canaanites, and you guessed it, the Egyptians. The Egyptians were fascinating culture, and they popped up right on time, located beside the Nile. This is when and where the Great Pyramids of Giza were built to the gods, which makes sense that their creation account had the universe come from nothing. It's called an ex nihilo story. And as we see in this fragment of their story, I am the eternal spirit. I am the sun that rose from primeval waters. My soul is God. I am the creator of the word. Evil is my abomination. I see it not. I am the creator of the order wherein I live. I am the word which will never be annihilated. In this my name of soul. worshippers there were struggling with an identity crisis for generations, yet most popularly, Amun-Ra retained such chief importance in the Egyptian pantheon that it developed into one point a virtual monotheism where the other gods became manifestations of him, comparable to that of Vedic Brahman. Similarly, prior to that, he was called Aten, and because of the monolateralistic or the monotheistic character of the Atenism religion, a link to Judaism or other mono-religions has been suggested by various writers. It's just one more example of this original God theory I have that I'm trying to point out to you. All of these different names and different times and origins of location all show that the people of these times were aware of the supernatural and sought connection then just as much as we do now. Different people may call the Creator by different names, but they're synonymous. Everyone is trying to name and explain He who is far too great to be named or understood. Names, words, explanations will always come up short. And while one group may connect with a warrior God, another group may connect with Him as the creator of the earth. And He is both of those things to both of those groups, drawing out different sides of His personality for them to connect. Of course, names and descriptions won't always match. For example, if you were to ask your siblings to describe your parents, then you'd probably all do so slightly differently. A stranger could assume that you guys are talking about different people because of that, but they'll simply be matters of perspective and semantics. I know my brothers and I don't call my mom and dad by the same pseudonym. One more hypothesis I have about this era regards the Nephilim. Nephilim are casually mentioned several times in the Bible as the offspring of angels and women. They were demigods of sorts. Ancient Egyptians believed that their pharaohs were God. My theory is that this wasn't entirely untrue. Those special pharaohs before the flood could have been Nephilim. It certainly explains their unbelievable intellect with creations like the pyramids, for example. Some people have speculated that the other gods in the BC era were actually demons in disguise because in Revelations 9:11, John calls the destroyer angel Apollyon, also known as Apollo. Apollo was a popular god in Greek mythology, which was inspired by Egyptian and Roman mythology. So there's another possible explanation because we all know that there's usually a little truth to every myth. But the Great Pyramids of Giza were made before citations of the Great Flood. They were thought to be burial tombs, but they've got no bodies, and their celestial mindfulness is unparalleled. To further this idea, the Great Flood could have also been an opportunity for the Creator to cleanse the earth of soulless humans, meaning those humans born before Adam and Eve were given the breath of life. Now all humans born of man and woman would carry the eternal spirit within them as well. So here we are in Genesis 10, and we've already covered the origins of earth, man, origins of earth, early man, civilizations part 1 and 2, and the rise of the 3 initial regions and their corresponding religions. It's 10 chapters in the first book, bringing us to my predicted date right over here of 2348 BC, give or take a couple hundred years. Yet it's 12 billion years or more of progress by our modern calendar. I got to this date by simply adding 1,656 years, as is noted in the geology accounts, through simple addition to Adam and Eve's timeline. As much as all of those so-and-so begot so-and-so begot so-and-so gets really boring, it can be very helpful. However, earlier than the Bible, the Great Deluge was told about in detail in the Urdu Genesis, which is believed to have been composed circa 2300 BC and is also referenced to by scholars as the Nippur Tables. We also have the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written in 2100 BC, way down over here. And so that works as well. Moving on, the next character to pop up in our story is another random dude named Abraham. I think most scholars will tell you that Judaism starts with this guy. The Creator noticed Abraham's heart for him and made a covenant with him to be partners. Henceforward, Abraham would become a great nation, his children like that of the stars. The promise was no joke. Abraham would go on to become the father of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This is a turning point from previous arrangements, and the Creator now opts for a one-on-one partnership, focusing on his faithful go-to guy. You can learn a lot about the Creator from those days. He's conversational, reasonable, capable of convincing, forgiving, and empathetic with Abraham. The most important part of the story is that the Creator promised to bless Abraham through his son. But when it seemingly takes too long to have a son with his wife, she suggests Abraham instead makes a child with their servant woman, who bears him the child Ishmael. But then his wife finally does conceive and gives birth to another son, Isaac. The people of Islam follow the lineage of Ishmael as the technically born firstborn son, while the people of Judaism, Christianity, follow the lineage of Isaac as the firstborn legitimate son. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why you don't do that. Homeboy made quite a mess. Now we have another major split in religion that continues even today, yet most people don't know that baby mama drama is the root of their religious differences. The story says that the Creator had chosen Abraham to establish a long-term partnership that would carry on through his children, because in a perverted and sad world, the Creator had found someone who was still righteous. He was probably really excited to be remembered and considered. Some of those crazy stories you read about in the Old Testament, like when the angels came to visit Abraham's relative Lot and the townspeople tried to rape the angels, those stories were intended to show how depraved and disgusting the earth had gotten, and how the Creator could be moved to punish and expel them. It's included to be revolting to the reader, not by any means as a justification point like I've heard some people reference. I noticed that there are several contentious viewpoints surrounding the origin of the Israelites due to the lack of evidence that Abraham's family once lived, which is interesting in its oddity that such a religiously significant man remains relatively unsubstantiated. Stories of the early Israelite nation may not have been verified because these were obscure nomadic peasants. That's what makes the message so special. Look what the Creator did for nobodies like Abraham because of his faith. The Creator could really multiply his offspring like the stars and did make him into an unforgettable nation. Ishmael fathered 12 sons who became leaders of warrior tribes. Isaac fathers the sons Jacob and Esau. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. He then fathers 12 more sons who become 12 tribes of Israel, aka the Israelites. That family was made of peaceful shepherds, except they really disliked one of their brothers, Joseph. So they sold him into slavery. Joke was on them. He actually got passed up the line and ended up in Egypt as Pharaoh's number 2 guy. So although Abraham hasn't been evidenced, Joseph has. His royal ring was uncovered at a dig site near Cairo. Here's where archaeology and the Bible match remarkably well in depicting the historical context of the patriarchal narratives. In Genesis 37:28, for example, Joseph is sold for 20 silver shekels, which is the exact going rate for a slave in the region 19th to 17th centuries BC, as affirmed by documents recovered from modern Syria and Iraq. The price of a slave rose steadily during those later centuries. If the story had been dreamed up, then it would be a very unlikely figure cited. Slaves, serfs, and nomads leave few traces of archaeological record. It's just how it goes. It's also important because this is how the Israelites end up in Egypt when they reconciled and moved to be with Joseph there. The Creator's blessing follows them there, and they greatly increase in number and wealth. Too much, in fact. After Joseph and his Pharaoh die, the new Egyptian leadership is oppressive and shrewd, aware of the risk that the Israelites could eventually become too powerful. So he deals with them harshly. Don't forget, these guys were shepherds, not warriors. Ultimately, they end up cruelly oppressed by the Egyptian rulers for about 400 years. But the Creator heard their cries for salvation. So he chooses a random baby named Moses to become his hands and mouth for his people's advocacy. As such, Moses narrowly escapes death as an infant born of an Israelite mother, yet he is miraculously adopted by Pharaoh's wife, who raises him as her own with her other son, Ramses. A weird series of events lands Moses on Mount Moab in modern-day Saudi Arabia, when the Creator speaks to him personally via a burning bush. When Moses asks to whom he is speaking with, the Creator responds, "I am who I am. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you." When I was writing this, I struggled with what name I'd use to refer to the Creator. An intelligent designer, the Lord, Brahman, Allah, El. It felt like I was choosing sides, and I didn't want to do that, as people are very emotionally attached to their identity for God. But it also felt like I was debasing and containing the Creator in a way that felt disrespectful to him. So I love how the Creator recognized the identity struggle his people had for him, and he cut right through it and unified their team identities. He was all of them, always and forever. Yahweh is derived from the Hebrew of the word I am. The Creator reminded Moses of his covenant promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he used the name I am to show his unchanging nature. Moses was tasked with convincing Pharaoh to let his people be freed, but Pharaoh wouldn't listen because he didn't know or respect Moses as God. He was a god in his own mind, and he worshiped a pantheon of other gods. By this point in history, the Egyptians had a different god for every city, and every god had their own personality and family and detailed backstory, all snowballing out of that initial retelling of God called Amun-Ra, and he saved the people from endless waters. The Middle Kingdom for Egypt brought in the newly redesigned religion celebrating Ra, the sun god, and Ra, Amzes, was the son of God. So when God sent the infamous 10 plagues on Egypt, each one was targeted at debasing the assorted gods of the region. Although there are several very promising leads for identifying Moses' brother, the Pharaoh, there was no undeniable ID yet due to the family name. Ramses in the Egyptian national records. Egypt was such a juggernaut with an amazing knack for logging their history that many other researchers have for centuries used their timetables as though they were infallible. Yet we know that the Egyptians were well known for deleting their embarrassing parts of the story from their history. In fact, the Bible specifically says that in his anger, Ramses removed Moses' name from all of the national records as punishment, which explains why we find no record of him. Yet the humble beginnings of the Israelites are so embarrassing that it can almost prove its truth. No nation would invent such an embarrassing history like that for themselves. So Pharaoh finally caves in. He lets Moses and the Israelites leave Egypt, and they cross the Red Sea, or possibly the Reed Sea, and they camp out in the desert. To this day, you can still go to the Sinai desert and see markings left by Hebrew slaves as evidenced by their particular characters used in the notations within the caves there. So there is archaeological evidence, not much, but some. And I say all of that because a common question I've heard is in regards to the records of Israelites. If they existed, where did they go? And this story is important to the big picture because it sets up another new grand attempt that the Creator made, again, to woo his people back into a relationship with him and remind them of the partnership that they had forgotten. He wants his people to know him. All of his actions are to get people to recognize and to know him. So a lot of the weird stuff he did in ancient times, like lead the Israelites to a dead end at the Red Sea while being chased by an Egyptian army, was so that when he parted the waters for them to escape, there was no denying that he exists and reigns supreme. Once they're out of Egypt, it's very easy to judge the Israelites. At this time, due to their constant grumbling, distrust, and how quickly they were to start worshiping other gods the moment they got out into the Sinai desert. But the religious culture of the people whom the Creator had called to be his had deeply been influenced by their neighbors. The Creator probably had to push out a lot of old habits constantly. To be more specific, Moses was Hebrew by birth, but raised in a polytheistic home where his dad and brother were gods. Jacob's sons had left polytheistic Canaan, namesake of the Canaanite religion, which mixed El Elyon, the God Most High, and multiple other gods such as Baal and Asherah. Then in Egypt, everyone around them worshiped a pantheon of gods. So although Moses had conversed personally with Yahweh, that's not to say that his wife and kids didn't hang around the water cooler at work discussing ideas and allowing contrary outside influences to continuously and subtly pull them back. It makes it easier to understand how the Israelites were so quick to fall back into old worship practices. The Creator constantly had to give them the message, no, not those other guys, just me. Plus, you should understand how muddy the waters were with no written code of conduct or clear dogma delivered. Enter the next major attempt. The Creator camps out with his people in the desert to give them written guidelines, which brings me to my own aha moment, like Oprah calls it. Philip Yancey has a book called Disappointment with God, and admittedly, I've struggled with that, y'all, and I put the book down for good. Like, I was settled in my heart after reading these verses because it was resolved for me permanently. It all made sense. So just let me quote him directly because he says it much better than I ever could. I have often longed for God to act in a direct, close-up manner. If only he would show himself. But in the Israelites' dreamy stories of failure, I can perceive certain disadvantages to God acting so directly. One problem they encountered immediately was the lack of personal freedom. For the Israelites to live in proximity to a holy God, nothing, not sex, menstruation, the content of clothing, fabric, or dietary habits could fall outside the purview of his laws. Being a chosen people had a cost. Just as God found it nearly impossible to live among sinful people, the Israelites found it nearly impossible to live with the holy God in their midst. And a far more serious problem arose. The closer God drew towards his people, paradoxically, the more distant they felt from him. Moses laid down an amazing elaboration of rituals necessary to approach God, and there was no margin for error. If you want to know what kind of personal relationship with God the Israelites enjoyed, listen to the words themselves. We will die. We are lost. We're all lost. Anyone who ever comes near the tabernacle of the Lord will die. And again, let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see his great fire anymore, or we will die. Ouch. Those are some pretty harsh but realistic responses. How sad I think it must have made the Creator feel to be so disliked. As much as he loves us, that doesn't mean that we're going to love him back. And the Israelites certainly did not love him back for very long. I'm sure he knew it was going to go badly, but that doesn't mean he wasn't going to give it a try. In fact, he gives it many tries. The entire Old Testament is this endless circle of this routine. It gets exhausting. The Creator draws the people in, and for a while they like it, then they cool off and become ungrateful and forgetful and leave him. Bad things happen, so they miss him and call him back. He shows up every time, but not without a couple of changes being made in their relationship. And then the cycle starts all over again. For example, they ask for just a couple of rules to clarify expectations. So he gives them the 10 Commandments, which said things like, thou shalt not make a graven image, which is why you won't find any iconography, not iconology, in the archaeological records for these people. He also gives them a very detailed guide to be healthy and holy, referred to as the law. Most of those weird requirements that you read in Deuteronomy, those were actually intended to help people. If you dig into some of the details of the particular things referenced and the ways that they would help people be hygienic, for example. Following their time wandering in the desert, the Israelites are led in conquest of the Holy Land of Canaan, a land intended to be restored to them after it was wrongfully taken away. There's really cool archaeological evidence surrounding the city of Jericho located in Canaan. It's the masthead of the Promised Land conquest, pun intended. But I'll talk about that more in my book, so you can check that out there. Let's be punny and camp out on this topic for a second. A lot of people have faulted the Creator for the instructions he gave the Israelites about their conquest of the Holy Land. How could a good God tell people to kill another? Namely, he told the Israelites to kill all the Canaanites. People have argued that a truly good and loving God would never and should never give such an instruction, so they can't believe in him or his goodness. Yet the supreme being that we're speaking of is an omnipotent God who can see past, present, and future. And the people of Canaan had for centuries been a horribly evil, unbelievably appalling nation. The Canaanite religion was polytheistic. Among many others, they worshipped a perverted version of El Elyon, God's namesake, but also Baal and Asherah, who were fertility gods. Religious orgies were required, and ceremonial child sacrifice involved burning their children alive by placing them in a statue of Baal's outstretched arms over fire. It was common in order to guarantee a nice crop that spring. Like, how awful is that? It's gross. Like, I don't even like talking about it. So the Lord's instruction to annihilate those particular evildoers was his just punishment after his calls for repentance were largely ignored in order to save future generations from such gross horrors. Too bad the Israelites didn't finish the job. As you could have guessed, the Canaanite influence was uglier than you can imagine. It almost becomes obnoxious to keep talking about these repeated cycles, as the Creator was probably challenged with how to respond to disobedient children continuously. the Creator tries an assortment of disciplinary methods detailed in the Old Testament. After the creation and the patriarch eras, there's the Exodus, then the conquest of the Holy Land, then judges are instituted to lead the people. After countless threats, punishments, reconciliations, and painful relapses, the Creator eventually, begrudgingly, goes silent. He never stopped loving his kids, but he did stop talking to them for 400 years. In other words, the Israelites were put in timeout. We'll pick back up and go from there next time, and I hope that you'll tune in and join me. I appreciate all you guys being here today. In the meantime, I'm Elizabeth Stephenson. Thank you so much for watching and for sharing and for liking. Hint, hint, wink, wink. So please subscribe and all the stuff like that. See you guys next time. Not me. Come join me in stilettos. But like, look at how fabulous those shoes are. I'm obsessed. I love these shoes. They're so pretty.